My daughter-in-law demanded the keys to my house, and when I refused, she slapped me in front of my own family. She thought she had just claimed my home. She had no idea she had just destroyed her own future. Please stick with me, because what happened next changed every life in that room. My name is Maren Hale, and I'm a widow in my early 60s. After my husband passed away years ago, I poured my heart into keeping the home we built together. Every room held memories of the life we shared, and every corner reminded me of the promises we made to each other. It wasn't just a house to me, it was the only place where I still felt close to him. When my son, Gage, married Brenna, I truly believed I was gaining the daughter I never had. She was warm, polite, and always knew the right thing to say. She brought flowers when she visited, offered to help in the kitchen, and made me feel like our family was growing stronger. Watching my son so happy filled me with hope that our future would be full of laughter and shared traditions. I welcomed Brenna with an open heart and trusted her completely. I never questioned her kindness because it seemed genuine. Looking back now, I realize I was only seeing the version of herself she wanted everyone else to see. The woman smiling across my dinner table was hiding someone completely different. I never imagined that the same person I embraced as family would one day treat me like I no longer belonged in my own home. A few weeks after the wedding, little things began to change. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining them. Brenna started walking through the house as if she had lived there for years instead of weeks. She would move family photos to different shelves, replace decorations I had carefully chosen with items she preferred, and rearrange furniture without asking me. Every time I returned home from running errands, something else had been changed. When I politely asked why she kept moving my things, she simply smiled and said she was modernizing the house. She acted as though she was doing me a favor, but it felt like pieces of my home were slowly disappearing. Then came the comments. Brenna often laughed and said people my age should think about downsizing because large homes were too much work. She'd mention how young couples needed more space to build their future, then glance around my living room as if she were already planning where everything would go. The remarks sounded casual, but they became more frequent with each visit. I finally shared my concerns with Gage, expecting him to understand. Instead, he brushed them aside. He insisted Brenna meant well and said she was only trying to make life easier for everyone. He told me not to take her words personally and asked me to be patient while they adjusted to married life. I wanted to believe my son. Rather than create conflict, I stayed quiet and ignored the growing discomfort. I kept hoping the tension would fade and that the kind woman I thought I knew would return. Sadly, those early warning signs were only the beginning. As the weeks passed, Brenna became less subtle about what she wanted. I noticed she was having private conversations with Gage whenever they visited. Their voices would drop the moment I walked into the room, and they would quickly change the subject. Before long, Gage began bringing up something that had never been discussed before: my house. He told me it would be smart to start planning for the future while I was still healthy. He said transferring the house early would make everything easier later and prevent unnecessary legal issues. According to him, it was simply responsible estate planning. Brenna nodded beside him, smiling as though she was only looking out for my best interests. But something about it didn't feel right. The conversations always seemed to focus on one thing: getting my signature. They never asked what I wanted for my future or whether I was ready to make such a decision. Instead, they spoke as if the house was already meant to be theirs and I was just delaying the process. During family dinners, Brenna became even bolder. She joked that older generations often held on to things for too long and made life harder for their children. She laughed while saying it, but her eyes always drifted toward me. The room usually felt quiet, and no one challenged her remarks. Each time the subject came up, I calmly told them I wasn't interested in signing my home over to anyone. I didn't argue or raise my voice. My answer was always respectful but firm. With every refusal, the atmosphere grew more uncomfortable, and I could feel an invisible wall forming between us. Deep down, I knew this wasn't about planning ahead anymore. It was about control. My birthday arrived, and I hoped it would be a chance for the family to relax and enjoy time together. I cooked everyone's favorite meals, decorated the dining room with fresh flowers, and even baked the chocolate cake my late husband used to request every year. For a little while, everything felt normal. My relatives laughed, shared stories, and wished me another happy year. After dinner, the conversation slowed as everyone gathered around the table with coffee and dessert. That was when Brenna suddenly cleared her throat and shifted the mood. She smiled politely before saying that birthdays were a good reminder to think about the future. Without hesitation, she brought up my house in front of everyone. She said Gage and she were ready to take responsibility for the property and believed it made sense for me to hand it over now instead of waiting. She spoke confidently, as though the decision had already been made. The room became uncomfortably quiet. A few relatives looked down at their plates, while others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one stepped in to stop her. I took a slow breath before answering. I reminded everyone that this wasn't just another piece of real estate. My husband and I had spent years building that home together, filling it with memories that couldn't be replaced. As long as I was alive, it would remain my home, and I had no intention of giving it away. Brenna's expression hardened the moment I finished speaking. Gage looked torn but remained silent once again. The celebration never recovered. What should have been a joyful evening ended with tension hanging over the entire family, and I realized the issue was far from over. As the evening came to an end, relatives began gathering their coats and saying their goodbyes. I thanked everyone for coming and walked them to the front door, trying to leave the uncomfortable conversation behind. I thought the worst part of the night was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Just as the last few guests stepped outside, Brenna moved in front of the doorway, blocking my path. The friendly smile she had worn all evening was gone. She folded her arms and looked directly at me. "Give me the house keys," she said calmly. "It's time for Gage and me to take responsibility for this place." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I realized she was completely serious. She held out her hand, waiting for me to place my keys in it as if I had no choice in the matter. I looked at her and quietly asked why she believed she had any right to demand something that belonged to me. She answered without hesitation, saying that sooner or later the house would be theirs anyway, so there was no reason to wait. According to her, I should step aside and let them start their future. I shook my head and slipped the keys back into my pocket. I told her, as calmly as I could, that the house legally belonged to me and that no one was taking it unless I decided otherwise. That decision was mine alone. The moment those words left my mouth, her face changed completely. Every trace of warmth disappeared, replaced by frustration and open anger. For months she had hidden her true feelings behind polite smiles. Now, standing only a few feet away from me, the mask had finally fallen. Before I could say another word, Brenna stepped closer. Her face was filled with anger, and without the slightest warning, she raised her hand and slapped me across the face. The force knocked my glasses to the floor, and the sharp sound echoed through the hallway. Every conversation stopped instantly. The room became so quiet that no one dared to move. I stood there in complete disbelief, my cheek burning as I looked around at the family members who had witnessed everything. Some stared at Brenna in shock, while others looked away, too uncomfortable to react. I kept waiting for someone to speak, especially my son. Gage rushed between us, but instead of standing beside me, he looked at both of us and said, "Everyone just calm down. Let's not make this any worse." His words hit harder than the slap. He didn't ask if I was hurt. He didn't tell his wife she had crossed an unforgivable line. He simply acted as though we shared equal blame for what had happened. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just losing the respect of my daughter-in-law. I had lost my son's willingness to protect me. I slowly bent down, picked up my glasses, and slipped them back on with trembling hands. I refused to give Brenna the satisfaction of seeing me break. I straightened my shoulders, looked directly at both of them, and spoke as calmly as I could. "You'll both regret today." Without another word, I turned and walked toward my room. No one tried to stop me. Behind me, the silence remained, but I knew everything had changed. They believed they had won that night. They had no idea they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brenna's hand striking my face and Gage standing there without defending me. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with them anymore. It was time to protect myself the right way. That morning, I drove to the office of my longtime attorney, Dalton Reese. He had worked with my husband and me for many years and knew every detail of our finances. The moment he saw me, he noticed something was wrong. After listening carefully to everything that had happened, he remained silent for a moment before opening several files from a locked cabinet. There was something my family had never known. Years before my husband passed away, he had built a successful commercial property company. After his death, ownership of the business had been transferred into a private trust with me as the sole beneficiary. I had kept it quiet because I never wanted money to become the center of our family relationships. That trust owned several commercial buildings across the county. One of those properties housed the office where Gage had worked for nearly 5 years. Another contained the boutique Brenna had proudly opened just a few months earlier. Neither of them had any idea their businesses operated inside properties controlled by my trust. Dalton explained that every lease, contract, and ownership document was perfectly organized and legally protected. I had never used my position to influence my son's life because I believed families should stay separate from business. But after everything that had happened, Dalton gently reminded me that protecting myself wasn't revenge. It was simply refusing to let people take advantage of my kindness any longer. Dalton asked me to bring every document Brenna and Gage had ever asked me to sign. I handed him a folder I had kept in my desk, thankful that I had never thrown anything away. He carefully examined each page, comparing signatures, dates, and legal language. The more he read, the more serious his expression became. After nearly an hour, he set the papers aside and explained what he had found. Brenna hadn't simply encouraged me to plan my estate. She had presented documents that contained clauses giving the impression she and Gage would gain rights they were never legally entitled to. The wording had been changed to benefit them, while the explanations they gave me painted a completely different picture. Dalton pointed out several sections that had obviously been rewritten after the original drafts. If I had trusted their explanations and signed those papers without reading them carefully, I could have surrendered important legal protections. Fortunately, I had refused every time they pressured me, leaving every altered document unsigned. Because those papers were still in my possession, they became evidence of an attempted manipulation rather than a completed transfer. Dalton organized everything into a file and assured me that the law was clearly on my side. He said no one could claim ownership through intimidation or misleading paperwork. Then he looked at me and spoke with quiet honesty. For years, I had remained patient because I wanted to preserve my family. But the people I had been protecting no longer showed me the same respect. He told me it was time to stop carrying the burden alone. Standing up for myself wasn't cruel. It was the first step toward making sure no one could ever try to take advantage of me again. Within a few days, the consequences of Brenna's actions began to unfold. I didn't seek revenge through anger or public humiliation. Instead, I allowed business matters that had been delayed for years to move forward. Every decision was reviewed by my attorney and handled according to the law. Nothing was done out of spite, only through proper legal procedures. Brenna was shocked when she received an official notice stating that the lease for her boutique would not be renewed at the end of its term. The letter was professional and gave her enough time to relocate her business. There were no hidden motives in the document, only a routine decision made by the property's ownership. Not long afterward, Gage called me with concern. His employer had informed the staff that the office building was now under new management. Daily operations would continue as usual, but the ownership trust had decided to become more involved in managing its commercial properties. He couldn't understand why these changes were happening all at once. The answers came sooner than either of them expected. Dalton contacted them regarding property records and ownership details. That was when they discovered the trust controlling both buildings had belonged to me for years. I had inherited my late husband's commercial property company and quietly managed it without ever discussing it with the family. Brenna stood speechless after learning the truth. She had believed I was simply an elderly widow living in a house she hoped to claim. She never imagined I owned valuable commercial properties connected to both her business and Gage's workplace. For the first time, she realized my quiet nature had never meant I lacked power. It simply meant I never felt the need to prove it. As the days passed, the truth began reaching the rest of the family. The relatives who had witnessed Brenna slap me couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. At first, many of them had stayed silent because they believed there had to be more to the story. Once they started asking questions, they realized they had only been hearing Brenna's version of events for months. One by one, family members came to visit me. They admitted Brenna had often spoken privately with them, claiming I was stubborn, controlling, and unwilling to help Gage build his future. She had carefully twisted ordinary conversations to make it appear that I was creating unnecessary conflict. Because she always sounded calm and convincing, several relatives had accepted her words without ever asking for my side. When they finally heard everything from me, including the repeated pressure to sign over my home and the confrontation that ended with the slap, their opinions changed completely. They realized my silence had never been guilt. I had simply refused to speak badly about my own family. Many of them apologized sincerely for judging me too quickly. Some admitted they regretted standing by without defending me that night. Their honesty couldn't erase what had happened, but it helped me understand that not everyone had meant to hurt me. Meanwhile, Gage found himself increasingly alone. The people who had once supported him began questioning why he had failed to protect his own mother. Every conversation forced him to confront the choices he had made. For the first time, he understood that remaining silent during a moment of injustice had consequences. The trust he had taken for granted was disappearing, and no excuse could easily repair the damage that had been done. A week later, there was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Brenna and Gage were standing together. They looked nothing like the confident couple who had walked out of my house after my birthday dinner. Their expressions were tense, and neither of them spoke for several seconds. Brenna finally broke the silence. With tears in her eyes, she apologized for everything she had said and done. She admitted that demanding my house keys had been wrong and begged me to give her another chance. She insisted she had let stress and fear about the future cloud her judgment. She promised she would never treat me that way again if I could forgive her. Then Gage stepped forward. He lowered his head and admitted he had failed me as a son. He said he should have defended me the moment Brenna slapped me. Instead, he claimed he had been trying to keep peace in his marriage and believed things would calm down if he stayed neutral. Looking back, he realized his silence had only caused more pain. I listened without interrupting. Their words sounded sincere, but I couldn't ignore the timing. Neither of them had apologized the day after the slap. They hadn't reached out when I was hurt or humiliated. They only came after their business situation changed and they learned the truth about my trust. When they finished speaking, I quietly thanked them for their apologies. I told them forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. I could choose to let go of my anger, but rebuilding trust required actions over time, not desperate words spoken after losing the security they believed would always be there. Before making any major decisions, I spent several days thinking about the kind of person I wanted to be after everything that had happened. I could have allowed anger to guide every choice, but I knew that would only keep me trapped in the pain they had caused. My husband had always believed that dignity was stronger than revenge, and I wanted to honor the life we had built together by living according to that belief. I met with Dalton again and asked him to update my estate plans. For years, I had assumed everything would eventually pass to Gage without question. After everything that had happened, I realized an inheritance should never be based on obligation alone. Trust and respect mattered just as much as family ties. I decided to remove Gage from several major inheritance decisions and restructure my estate to reflect the values my husband and I had shared. One of the changes brought me a sense of peace. We arranged for a significant portion of my estate to be donated to charities that supported housing assistance, education, and veterans programs, causes my husband had cared deeply about throughout his life. Knowing those resources would help people in need felt far more meaningful than rewarding those who had tried to take advantage of me. When the paperwork was complete, I felt lighter than I had in months. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply making thoughtful choices about my own future. For too long, I had mistaken endless sacrifice for love. At last, I understood that love without respect eventually becomes exploitation. Protecting my peace wasn't selfish. It was the healthiest decision I had made in years. A few days later, I invited the entire family to my house for one final conversation. I didn't want another argument or another round of accusations. I simply wanted everyone to hear the truth directly from me. When they arrived, the room was quiet. No one knew exactly what I was going to say, but they could all sense that this meeting would bring everything to a close. I thanked everyone for coming and calmly explained the decisions I had made. I told them I had updated my estate plans, secured my assets, and chosen a future that reflected the values my late husband and I had always shared. None of those choices were made out of anger. They were made because trust had been broken, and once that foundation is destroyed, it cannot be rebuilt with promises alone. I looked at Gage and told him I would always love him because he was my son. That would never change. But love did not erase what had happened. When I needed him most, he chose silence instead of standing beside me. I hoped he would learn from that mistake and become a better man, but that journey was his to make. Then I turned to Brenna. She avoided my eyes, saying nothing. I simply told her that my home would remain mine for as long as I lived. No amount of pressure, manipulation, or apologies would ever change that. The discussion was over. No one argued. Brenna sat completely speechless, realizing the control she had tried so hard to gain was gone forever. As my family quietly left that evening, I closed the front door with peace in my heart, knowing I had finally protected both my home and my dignity. Several months passed, and for the first time in a long while, my life felt peaceful again. The tension that had once filled my home was gone. I spent my days doing the things I had neglected for years. I reconnected with old friends, visited places my husband and I had always wanted to see, and welcomed people into my home who appreciated my company instead of viewing me as an obstacle. My house once again became a place of warmth, comfort, and happy memories. Life moved forward for everyone. Gage eventually came to understand that silence has consequences. He realized that failing to defend the people who love you can damage relationships in ways that apologies cannot easily repair. Although we slowly began speaking again, he accepted that rebuilding trust would take patience and consistent actions, not just regret. Brenna was left to face the results of her own choices. She had spent so much time chasing control that she lost the respect of the very family she wanted to influence. Her greed had cost her far more than she ever expected, and there was no one else to blame. As for me, I no longer carried bitterness. I had learned that protecting yourself doesn't make you unkind. Sometimes it is the only way to preserve your peace and self-respect. Looking back, I realized the hardest part wasn't nearly losing my home. It was discovering how easily trust could be broken by the people closest to me. The house I fought to protect became more than walls and memories. It stood as a reminder that dignity cannot be taken unless you surrender it. Standing up for myself didn't end my story. It gave me the chance to begin a happier chapter.